Morning to some. My name is Doug Scott. I'm a vice president with the Great Plains Institute, and along with my colleague Lola Schoenrich, it's our pleasure to welcome you to this webinar where we're going to discuss best practices for standby rates for combined heat and power. We're really pleased to be joined by Jamie Scripps of Hunterston Consulting and by Carl Linville of the Regulatory Assistance Project. They're going to kind of lead us through a discussion as we go along, what we think is a really important issue as we look at ways to try to drive energy efficiency throughout the Midwest and the rest of the country. I was on the Illinois Commission for a few years, and during a potential study that we did, one of the big areas where we thought we were really lacking was in trying to support combined heat and power and to really utilize that to the maximum extent that we could. We know that standby rates are a very important piece of that, trying to ramp up CHP, and so we're going to be talking about that today. If we can go to the next slide. Just a quick word, a couple of slides about GPI. We actually work in spite of our name, we actually are broader than just the Great Plains. We've actually been doing work over the last few years in 40 plus states around the country. Our goal is to try to, as you see there, decarbonize electricity production, add in zero and low carbon fuels, carbon capture for beneficial use and permanent storage, as well as increasing energy efficiency and productivity, which is a large part of our discussion today. Go to the next slide. We treat things a little bit differently at GPI. Our goal is, while we have as you saw from the last slide, while we have a point of view and a mission, we try to bring people together that very often have very diverse views and try to see if there are ways that we can move issues forward. Try to understand the political realities in different places and understand that everybody doesn't look at all of these issues the same way. So our goal is to try to figure out the best way to move these policies forward. We do a lot of facilitation and consensus building along with the advocacy. Next slide. We have 4 programs. Electricity and efficiency is the area that I head up. We also have a program on transportation and fuels. One on communities, which is headed up by Lola, who you'll hear from a little bit later on, and also a carbon management program that really focuses on carbon capture and beneficial use there. The electricity and the communities team, principally the communities team, have been working on the CHP issue for quite some time. If we go to the next slide. So, as the slide says, in the last few years, we've really had a strong history of supporting CHP policy work in the Midwest. We've been actively engaged in standby rates work, initially supporting the development of the Apples to Apples standby rate analytical tool to inform stakeholder comments in the Minnesota standby rates proceeding in 2015. Subsequently, using that same tool, GPI has been active in supporting technical assistance in standby rate discussions across a number of states, including Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. We're not the only group working on this topic, of course. The Regulatory Assistance Project, or RAP, published a paper on standby rate best practices in 2014, and NARUC also passed a resolution in the last year. RAP is working with us on this work to ensure that our recommendations are in alignment with the prior work that they had done on this. So we hope that our work developing updated standby rate best practices will be useful in informing a number of interested parties, whether that's utility commissions, utilities themselves, customers, and developers as well. And a lot of our work has been done, especially over the last few years, with Jamie Scripps, who you're going to hear from in just a few minutes. So we're going to hear from both Carl and from Jamie. And then we'll have questions after the presentations. As you saw from the chat that Alyssa put up, feel free to post your questions in the chat. If it gets to 1 o'clock Central and we've still got a lot of questions, we can go past that time if folks want, and maybe at that point we can open it up for a little bit more kind of informal discussion as well. And I apologize in advance of having to drop off before the end of the hour myself. My colleague Lola will take over at that point as I have a different presentation I have to be on and give myself in a few minutes. This is being recorded. We are recording the presentations themselves. And we'll plan to record the questions and answers as well. If anybody has an issue with that, please just post that in the chat, and we can recognize that at the time. Obviously, we want to get the presentations recorded so that they can be shared with other folks. But if people don't want their questions recorded, just let us know in the chat. So Carl is going to start off setting the table on how rate design matters. And then Jamie will take it from there and talk about the paper, the research work that she has done with us on the standby rates issue. So I think it's going to be very informative, and hopefully we'll get some good questions from you along the way as well. So let me introduce both Carl and Jamie up front, and then when Carl's finished, he will just pass it on to Jamie, and then we'll reconvene for some questions. Dr. Carl Linville is a principal with RAP's U.S. team and is based in Davis, California. With his expertise in power sector markets, procurement, and planning, he leads RAP's work on renewable energy integration and transmission planning in the Western United States. Carl focuses on distributed generation valuation and tariffs, as well as regional reliability solutions. Prior to joining RAP, Carl served as Public Utilities Commissioner in Nevada, as the Economic and Energy Advisor to Nevada Governor Kenny Gwinn, and an academic economist at the Sam Walton College of Business at the University of Arkansas, as well as other positions. And he's very prolific in terms of writing and speaking. You've probably heard him on many occasions before. So we're really thrilled to have Carl and RAP's expertise working with us on this project. As we also are thrilled to have Jamie Scripps' expertise working with us on this project. Jamie is a principal with Hunterston Consulting, where she offers advanced energy policy expertise to clients across the Midwest. Jamie's standby rate research has been featured in a number of proceedings throughout the country, and she's a recognized expert on policies related to cogeneration. Jamie has also served as an expert consultant with ICF and a senior associate for the Midwest Climate Policy with the U.S. Climate Alliance. In 2016, Jamie was featured as a Midwest Energy News 40 Under 40 awardee. Prior to founding Hunterston Consulting, Jamie was a partner with Five Lakes Energy, LLC. So Carl and Jamie, thank you very much for being with us today. Carl, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to have been invited in a small way, to help out here. Jamie has done really important work for GPI. I think the survey that Jamie conducted, the findings of that survey with that cross-section of stakeholders that she interviewed, is a really important contribution and provides us with a nice roadmap, both of what appear to be some consensus or mostly consensus, best practice starting points, as well as some look forward into where we might be needing to take further conversations on standby rates going forward. So thank you, Jamie, for your work, and thank you to Jamie and GPI for inviting me to help in this small way. So you most likely are, I hope you're familiar with RAP's rate design manual, the Smart Rate Design for a Smart Future that's shown here. RAP has been active in rate design for a long time. As a companion to this Smart Rate Design manual, following up on an engagement for the California Public Utility Commission, where we assisted the staff there with research on non-residential rate design. I wrote, with the assistance of Jim Lazar, a piece for the Electricity Journal that lays out non-residential rate design and what the principles are behind establishing non-residential rate design. So to just start our conversation today and to get us sort of settled in where this standby rates conversation lives in the universe more broadly of non-residential or commercial rate design, I'm going to give this little bit of background. I do have to dance on Ahmed Faruqi for just a minute, because Ahmed did a Electricity Journal special issue on rate design, which he invited Jim and I to contribute to. Much to his chagrin, our article was the lead article chosen by the editor to lead his issue. Ahmed and I and Rap don't always agree, but we do agree on many things. So it was, I encourage you to look at the Electricity Journal piece. It was published in October of 2018. Next slide, please. So, at the highest level, the very basic problems that we have with non-residential rate design throughout the country are that, first of all, most non-residential rates don't align customer rates with system costs. Most non-residential or commercial rates collect a large amount of revenues from non-coincident peak demand charges. Non-coincident peak demand charges tend to be very poorly correlated with system costs. So it doesn't really make sense. If you want to encourage commercial customers to use energy and produce energy in a way that aligns with system needs and system costs and system conditions, anchoring a large part of the customer's cost on a non-coincident peak demand charge is really not a good idea. And in many places in the country, non-coincident peak demand charges recover 60% or even more of the total amount of revenues from commercial customers. Some commercial customers like non-coincident peak demand charges if they're very high, very high usage, consistent usage like grocery stores and so forth. But more broadly, it's a problem. Second problem, technological change and the emergence of DERs are really making changes necessary because system conditions and the cost on the system are changing, and the availability of when energy is available on the system is changing. And so really moving more towards a time of use rate design where your energy cost is differentiated based on your time of use. And it really makes some sense. So I have, on the next slide, I have a very, very simple characterization of the non-residential rate design. There's a customer charge that should be tied to dedicated facilities associated with a customer site, recovery of those costs. Then there's some demand charge, and that can be a combination of a coincident, non-coincident peak demand charge, or lots of different ways of doing that. But usually there's a demand charge, and it's fairly significant. The flaw with most demand charges is that they're not linked to system conditions in any way. And a lot of this work, that a lot of Jamie's findings and the best practices actually have to do with differentiating demand charges for standby customers, based on the impact that the different rates have. For example, she's going to talk to you about the demand charge for maintenance. She's going to talk to you about, I'm not going to steal her whole show, but a lot of the changes that are suggested are ones that actually improve the alignment of the demand charges with cost causation. Secondly, energy charges in many places are not time differentiated. And as I mentioned, because system conditions are changing, there really should be, if you want to encourage customers to make consumption and production choices that align with system conditions that therefore produce benefits for all customers, you really need to move away from flat energy charges to time differentiated ones. So next slide, please. So our summary way at RAP of conveying all of this is that rate design should make the choices that the customer makes to optimize their own bill. So if you're a CHP operator, the choices that you make to optimize your own bill, those production choices you make, those consumption choices you make, we'd like the choices that you make that optimize your bill for your profitability to be consistent with the ones we would like to make collectively to minimize system cost. We'd like to align your private interest with the public interest as much as possible. So for the benefit of you to optimize your operations and to the benefit of all customers to minimize system costs. One final note I'll make before I pass this off to Jamie is that what this looks like today is not going to be what it looks like 3 years from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now. We have so much change going on in the electricity sector right now that there are a number of things coming up. Considerations of community resilience, for example, considerations of whether you would operate hybrid technologies to optimize your own operations. For example, you might have some solar in addition, or some storage in addition to your conventional CHP cogeneration facility. And you might be weaving in electric transportation into your operations in some way that may affect, how you use energy. All these changes that are happening means that we're going to have to, and at the same time, the system is changing. So as the resources providing energy to the system change, as we have more variable energy, so forth, then those system costs are changing. So the principles that are provided today are a great starting point. And they're ones that we should reconsider over the years as system conditions change and as customer technologies change. But with that, Jamie, I'll hand it off to you to present your interesting findings.
Thank you so much, Carl, and thank you to REP in general. A lot of this research was really based on the great previous work of REP in this area. So we're just so thrilled to have you here with us and have you participating in this. So hi, everybody. Lots of familiar faces. Many of you have been involved in this phase of the research, and lots of you have been involved over the years in previous iterations of this research, whether it was the apples to apples work we did. And I want to send a special shout out to the Midwest Cogeneration Association, the CHP Alliance, Energy Resources Center, all key partners along the way in taking a look at standby rates for CHP. So this is the result of lots of collaboration and many years of work on this. So today I'll be presenting on survey results and interview results around the idea of best practices in standby rates. And this is building upon the apples to apples work we did looking across various utilities at their different approaches to standby rates and rate design for standby rates for CHP. But just to ground the conversation to start with, we'll definitionally, standby rates are charged to customers with on-site distributed generation, such as CHP. We're really focused on CHP here, but one of the big lessons of this research and one of the interesting aspects of this conversation for me has been how the conversation around CHP also opens the door to thinking about this evolving paradigm with customers owning other types of distributed generation. And so the certain themes that we'll talk about today, like transparency and simplicity, certainly translate beyond CHP to other types of technology as well. They're sort of universal to this idea of customers wanting to make informed decisions and needing to, because increasingly they are installing their own on-site types of generation. So standby rates in particular, they're intended to help the utility recover costs that are related to the specific type of service they're providing, which is providing backup electricity service during scheduled and unscheduled outages of a customer CHP system, and that's really critical. That's the context in which we are looking at standby rates for CHP. It's in the context of knowing that once in a while throughout the year, just for proactive maintenance, we're going to need to use standby service, and that would be an example. In maintenance or scheduled outages are examples of that proactive maintenance that is scheduled ahead of time that we know for sure we're going to need to do to keep that system up and running efficiently. And then, of course, there's the other type of outage, which is an unscheduled outage or a forced outage, and those happen as well. And so the utility needs a way to recover costs associated with reserving and providing backup service during both of those types of outages of the customer CHP system. And so we'll talk about what are some of the best practices to differentiate between these two outages, and helping the customer, of course, make informed decisions from the very beginning when they're thinking about the potential of installing a CHP system, and then throughout the year as they're thinking about when to schedule those scheduled maintenance outages and how to maintain their system, what kind of incentives might there be within the rate itself to incent maintenance and keeping the system operating efficiently, which can have benefits for the utility system as a whole. So Alyssa, we can go to the next slide. So over the years, as we did the apples to apples comparison, looking at all these different utility approaches to standby rates, we noticed that there were some best practices beginning to emerge, and a big shout out and a thanks goes to the folks in Minnesota who really led the way. There was a dedicated proceeding on standby rates where there was just a deep dive on what the utilities that filed, they were participating, they filed their existing standby rate approach, and then they went through a real collaborative process revising those approaches. And we saw some great practices emerge even there just in Minnesota. And then from there, across the Midwest and then across the country, we've seen great examples of utilities kind of dusting off their old standby rates and refreshing them, taking a new look, because we do have increased focus on distributed generation, increased focus on customer education. So there's good reason to kind of freshen up our look on standby rates. And places like, in addition to Minnesota, in Michigan, there's been a real thoughtful collaborative stakeholder process around standby rates as well. And so we've seen it across different states, regulators, policymakers interested in taking a fresh look at standby rates. And even in 2019, NARUC, they expressed their interest in taking a fresh look at standby rates, making sure they're transparent, accessible for customers. So some of this, we were noticing it across, it was in the ether. These best practices were beginning to emerge, but Great Plains Institute recognized that additional work was needed to kind of take these emerging best practices. Let's define them, let's standardize them, let's vet them through a stakeholder process, through the survey interview process. That's what we did in this phase of the research. And that's what we're focused on today, presenting the results from the survey and the interviews, talking about the themes that emerged. And then this white paper is out there now for you all to use as a resource. We hope it will be helpful as regulators, utilities, CHP developers, all the stakeholders that are interested in this topic as we continue to move forward. We're not done by any means. This is a really important barrier that needs to be overcome in order to optimize the use of CHP. And so we want to provide this as a resource to kind of help overcome that barrier and capture the opportunities that CHP offers. So in the range of stakeholders we talk to, and thank you. I know a lot of you are actually on the line today. A lot of you participated in the survey, one-on-one interviews. Thank you all for the time you put into this. We all learned a lot. Loved hearing from you about your experiences with standby rates and also your concerns. And through the interview process as well, and I'll flag this at the end, there were other themes that came up too that were beyond standby rates, but that we captured as sort of related either barriers or opportunities related to the deployment of CHP that we wanted to capture here, because it's important to know that standby rates, they're not the only barrier to the deployment of CHP by any means. There's a whole context of barriers and opportunities that need to be understood. So we're focused here on standby rates, and it's definitely a complicated, nuanced topic that deserves its own attention. So I'm glad we're doing that, but also understanding that there's a broader conversation too around CHP barriers and opportunities that needs to advance, and it's great to see so many stakeholders interested and engaged on all those other topics as well. So thanks again for everyone on the line that put in time on this. We think we have some valuable results, and I'm excited to share them with you today. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, of course, I do want to call out specifically, and so these resources they're captured in the white paper. So you will have access to these links if you want to go check out any of the prior work. You know, we've got in 2019, I put out a paper where things stand on standby rates that kind of caught us up to date on all the activities, and you get a sense for at that moment what some of the emerging best practices were. Exergy Partners and Entropy Research have a great study that they did for the Pennsylvania PUC CHP working group on standby and capacity reservation charge best practices, and review that. That was actually a really foundational piece for a lot of this as well. A lot of the emerging best practices were taken from the great work done in Pennsylvania. And then, of course, the US EPA CHP partnership has been following this, studying this issue for a long time, providing educational resources and webinars. So in 2018, there was a great webinar that they held as well, and we've got a link to that. And then I think we have an additional slide on this, Alyssa. Is that possible? Yep. Okay. And then here, of course, we come back to RAP's great work from 2014, standby rates for combined heat and power systems, and US EPA with their paper, standby rates for customer cited resources as well. So this has been a conversation that's been going on for a long time, and my hope is that it continues and continues to be thoughtful. And I'm hoping that this white paper is an additional resource that can help us continue the great conversation. All right, let's keep going here. So in this phase of the research, we did interviews and focus groups in addition to an online survey. So first folks took the online survey, and then there was an opportunity to sort of volunteer for a one-on-one interview or a group setting interview. And those were really rich with examples and people's lived experiences with dealing with standby rates, whether it was CHP developers thinking about how standby rates are going to affect the economics of a potential project, or tales from a year in the life of a CHP system that experienced outages, whether scheduled or unscheduled, and how the particular utility approach in that situation affected the actual economics of that system. So a lot of good stories, a lot of good feedback about what's working, what's not working so well, and maybe some recommendations going forward. Because we do the story is it's not all bad news. I mean, there's definitely some great examples out there, and that gives me a lot of hope and optimism, because I think the more we can point to models and examples of how to get this right, that's going to make it easier for folks to do the right thing and to dust off their old approaches and make real improvements that have a real impact. So we can move ahead to the next slide. Okay, so the survey results. Go ahead, next slide. So the first substantive question in the survey was, should it be considered a best practice for standby rates to be reasonably simple and transparent, such that customers and third parties can make informed decisions based on reading the published tariff and any accompanying educational materials. So we can go to the next slide. This shows you the results. In this one, we weren't super surprised that there was overwhelming support for this idea of transparency and simplicity from a customer perspective. But we wanted to quantify this. We want to show you this because it's really important from the customer perspective that that utilities and regulators take this piece to heart, because it's so important as folks consider whether to install a CHP system. They're doing calculations to figure out whether the project's going to pencil out, how much the standby service is going to cost them. That's an important factor. And the customer needs to have enough information to be able to make those calculations. And I can tell you that utility tariffs regarding standby rates vary widely, not just in terms of what's being charged. And that was one of the big findings of the apples to apples comparison, is we looked at utilities across different territories and then across state lines. And we took a standard size, 2 megawatt size system, I think is what we used as our example. And we just ran it through a bunch of outage scenarios, and we calculated what a customer would pay each month. And the numbers were all over the place because each utility had a different approach. And we'll talk, and as we talk about these best practices, I think you'll see that there are a variety of different ways that this can be done. Aside from what we're recommending today, there's a lot of nuance. So each utility has its own approach, which generates a different monthly bill. And that was one of the big takeaways of the apples to apples, was how all over the place that was. But the other takeaway was the experience of having to pick up the tariff book and make the calculations ourselves as part of of doing the study. Sometimes it was really easy, and sometimes it was much more difficult and required lots of conversations with utility representatives who were great. Often they were really great in working with us and worked through the calculations with us. And then sometimes it was so complicated that even folks within the utility struggled to understand how these calculations were supposed to take place. So this is really going to benefit not only the customer, but folks within the utility, and certainly the regulators too, who are trying to understand the approach and understand whether it's reasonable. I think that aiming for more transparency and simplicity is a great goal. And what I'll say, and I think we have a slide on this later, but I'll just say ways that I've seen this done well include billing simulations. This is something we saw in that Minnesota proceeding that focused on standby rates in particular. It was a requirement that not only did the utilities file their tariffs as they stood at that moment, but they also needed to provide an example of what various customers would experience. And that was partly how the apples to apples comparison was born, because we really liked the idea of the billing simulations. That was helpful, but we wanted to compare across utilities, and that was how we figured that we needed to do kind of an apples to apples comparison on the numbers. But from a transparency standpoint, those billing simulations were a great start. And so something like that, taking customers through a hypothetical example, that's a great start toward transparency. Another example I've seen is an online bill calculator. These can be helpful to the customer. The only caveat I'd add is that the customer really needs to understand the calculations behind the calculator. So a calculator alone, like the front end of it, is not sufficient. It's probably a good start, but understanding how those charges are calculated on a monthly basis, that's really important too for understanding how the CHP system is going to need to be operated and run and maintained throughout the year in order to sort of stay, like if they're making certain assumptions about costs, we want to make sure that those are reasonable. And so we want to make sure that really that there's a good understanding of how it works. And so, so bill calculators can work as long as we understand how the tariff's actually operating. And then finally, I think we've seen some great examples. I think Otter Tail in Minnesota has a nice example of this. And this is now a recommendation across a couple of states. They've recommended that utilities file one or two, I'd say one sheeter, but sometimes they leak onto two sheets because there's a lot of information that needs to be captured because standby rates are complicated. But something that is simpler and easier to digest than what's in the tariff, because the tariff has a lot of boilerplate and it needs to be sufficiently detailed to meet, certain regulatory standards. But then from a customer education standpoint, if you can simplify it and identify what are the charges, if there are differences in time of use, or if there's differences for on peak, off peak, and capturing all that information in a really customer friendly way, I think that's a great tool as well. So understanding that there's a need to communicate what's in the tariff to the customer, and understanding that there's an opportunity to make that clearer and clearer and simpler. I think that those would be steps in the right direction there. All right, we can move on to the next question. This question related to forced outage rates. Should it be considered a best practice to take into account both the utilities cost and the forced outage rate of the customer's generators on the utility system? And the impetus for this question was really thinking about how forced outage rates, there's a couple of things here. They can be an indicator of the potential likelihood of a forced outage, which those are the outages that are going to be more costly on the system because they're unscheduled. But also there's an incentive. If there's an incentive to keep the forced outage rate for your system low, then you're going to see more proactive maintenance of the system. You're going to see customers engaging in responsible behavior about maintenance that we want. Those are the kind of price signals that we want to send. So it's a way of keying the charges that a customer experiences to the system costs, which goes back to what Carl was, he presented this as just an overall best practice. So let's go on to the next slide. And here we got 70%. So forced outage rates, there's strong support. It's not overall consensus, strong support though for including the forced outage rate in the calculation. And here a nuance or a caveat that I would throw out there would be just if you don't have forced outage rate information for your specific system, you can look to average forced outage rates for your type of system. That's a workaround we've seen in a couple of utility approaches. So something to think about. This would be a great way to get at a couple of the best practices that Carl was mentioning in terms of keying it to the system costs. All right, next slide. Question 3 was, should it be considered a best practice for the energy component of standby rates to reflect time of use, for example, by reference to locational marginal pricing? We can go to the next slide here and see the results. A lot of people thought this was a great idea. So, and it's not surprising because again, if you're keying parts of the calculation of standby charges to the time of use, then you are keying it to system costs to an extent. I will say the to an extent is just means that we're talking about the energy component. And as Carl mentioned, and as we'll see through the remainder of these best practice recommendations, the energy component really isn't, and that's the per kilowatt hour charge for standby rates. That's not where the action is, so to speak. So it's great to try to key the energy per kilowatt hour charge to system costs to the extent that that's important, but I would mark that as less of a priority just because demand charges, the per kilowatt charges are so much more of a driver of what can make standby rates a barrier to CHP. So this one's great. I'm not objecting to it. I just want to put it into the context of, in terms of priorities. This one might not be top of the list just because the other demand charge related best practices are probably top of the list. We can keep going. Should it be a best practice to use prorated daily or hourly as used demand charges for backup power? This one, you can go ahead to the next slide. This one really aligns with Carl's talk. And this one didn't have sort of a consensus. I mean, we have 62%, so we have strong support. But this is one where I think folks need to get comfortable with this approach, but there are great models out there. So that's what I would point to. I would point to models where utilities are doing this very effectively. And in fact, DTE in Michigan, I believe they have an on-peak daily demand charge. So you're capturing when there's an outage, you know, on a daily basis. You're not projecting it out over the month, but it's daily, and it's only for those that were on peak. So that is a nice way to key it to the system costs. And that would be that's definitely something we look for when we look at utility approaches, that whether you can key it to daily or even hourly, getting it as granular as possible so that you're only capturing the amount of time that the system was out. That's a great way to give the customer an incentive to keep those outages short and not on peak. And it's also a way to reflect actual cost causation. We can go to the next slide. This question gets to the difference between maintenance and forced outages. So should it be considered a best practices and standby rates for maintenance demand charge rates to be discounted relative to backup demand charge rates to recognize the scheduling of maintenance service during periods when the utility generation requirements are low? So it's all about the difference between scheduling those maintenance outages ahead of time, and you can do that in collaboration and coordination with the utility to make sure that you're scheduling at times when the system costs won't be high. So it's a win-win to keep those lines of communication open. Yeah, it makes sense to discount that behavior relative to backup demand charges for forced outages. We really want to incentivize scheduling maintenance services when costs are low. So we can see the results on the survey on the next slide. Here, it's very strong support for this. And I think that the other thing I'd mention from our previous research on this topic was it's really important when you look at a utility's approach to maintenance service, read the fine print and understand when the months of the year during which maintenance is permitted. So we saw examples of utilities providing this kind of discount for maintenance service, but there were like 4 months a year when you could potentially schedule your maintenance. Other months of the year, even if you scheduled ahead of time, it would be considered an unscheduled outage, and you'd get docked accordingly. So a companion recommended practice that we didn't really ask about specifically here, but something that I'll put out there is from a customer perspective, it would be great to see as much flexibility as possible from a utility in when those scheduled outages can be scheduled, understanding that sometimes it's not going to work. Sometimes the utility is not going to want the customer to schedule an outage during a certain period of time, but opening those lines of communication to allow for as much flexibility as possible. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So question number 6 asks, should it be considered a best practice in standby rates for a utility to recover fixed costs through the use of demand ratchets? This one I consider it to be the other side of the coin with the on-peak daily demand charges in a way, because here we're going to spread it out with a ratchet. You spread it out over not only the whole month, but the whole year based on a certain level of demand. And with a ratchet, you're really eliminating the price signals that you want, and you're getting further away from a connection to the system costs. So if we go to the next slide, we didn't have a lot of support for demand ratchets in the survey and the interviews. So my advice or my recommendation would be instead look to those on-peak daily or hourly demand charges instead that really narrows it to when the outages are, tries to tie what's the charges to the customer very closely to those system costs. And it provides really good price signals, whereas a demand ratchet, one of the unfortunate results of a demand ratchet is that it really eliminates a lot of the incentives there might be otherwise for good customer behavior and efficient use of the grid. And we can go to the next slide. Should it be considered a best practice in standby rates for demand charges to be assessed based on a facility's coincident peak? And we can go to the next slide. We heard Carl talk about this one quite a bit. This one, we may need more information on this one. This one was kind of split. I think that in general, folks like the idea of tying charges to system costs, whether it's through tying to coincident peak or some other design. I think that's where we want to see some more models and maybe think about this one a little bit more, but this one was interesting, and this one is definitely worth further investigation. We can go to the next slide. And now those were the survey results. Here are some themes that came up through the interviews. Transparency and simplicity. I've already really talked about this at length, but there was overwhelming support for transparency and simplicity in standby rates. I love Steve's quote here. Steve Huso of Excel Energy in Minnesota stated in his interview, but I think it might be his mantra because he's, I think, stated it before in stakeholder proceedings, but a limited amount of complexity is feasible. So we should use complexity where it does the most good. And I think that's a great takeaway from this theme from the interviews. We can go to the next slide. So we just talked about the demand ratchet question. 75% of survey respondents disagreed that it should be considered a best practice in standby rates for a utility to recover fixed costs through demand ratchets. And a number of interviewees expressed doubts as to the fairness of demand ratchets, citing a strong preference for as-used demand charges, which were supported by 62% of survey respondents. We can go to the next slide. A theme going forward that everyone should keep in mind is on the topic of distribution costs and distribution charges. Increases in distribution spending by utilities in the future may create elevated tension between utility and customer interests in standby rate design. We're already seeing this in some proceedings, and going forward, this is where a lot of the action is going to be in terms of utility investment. The distribution grid is going to be, it's going to need a lot of investment. And so there'll be some tension in this discussion. And I think that as a result, this may warrant a fresh look at how standby rate customers are charged for their partial and infrequent use of the distribution system. And I'll just say that, when we did the apples to apples and we picked apart the various components of standby rates, distribution charges were often not prorated based on a standby rate customer's partial and infrequent use of the grid. But we have seen some examples recently of where regulators have encouraged or required some kind of proration of distribution costs for standby rate customers. So this is not a settled area, and it's deserving of further investigation, in part because I think it's going to be a really hot topic going forward. Next slide. And this is not related to standby rates, but it came up a lot in the interviews. So I just want to call out interconnection standards, standardized interconnection rules. They're also helpful in promoting safe and reliable parallel operation of DG facilities. So interviewees remarked that the easier it is for system owners to navigate the interconnection rules and procedures, the easier it will be to realize the benefits of DGs such as CHP. Next slide. And data, real world CHP data can really help. They can help utilities, regulators, and other stakeholders better understand how systems perform. So we get at this a little bit with our mention of forced outage rates and how forced outage rates might be able to be factored into standby rates, tying standby charges back to system costs, perhaps. With actual performance data, benefits and risks of CHP operation can be analyzed and integrated into how customer standby charges are calculated, increasing fairness and accuracy of cost-based rates. Okay. So now we're on to questions.
No questions?
We sort of sped through those last, Lola told me to speed up a little bit. So I always listen to Lola, so.
I wanted to make sure that
Yeah.
we had time for all of your questions.
Yep.
Interesting question. How close are we to where large industrials are not even part of the utility system and not needing standby? Maybe for either of you.
Yeah, I'd be interested how Carl will respond to this. I think it can be, I mean, it's something that utilities should be mindful of for sure. I think it's a scary thought for some utilities. I think that I think there's a strong incentive for utilities to work with large industrial customers for mutually beneficial situations so that doesn't happen. And I think one way to do that is to dust off standby rate approaches and make sure they're fair and reasonable and transparent. But Carl, do you have a response to that?
I don't know how close we are. I think about microgrids as being kind of a next possible step where a CHP may operate as a microgrid, and some places are establishing microgrid tariffs that have terms and conditions that in some cases kind of look like standby tariffs. So I think large industrials are definitely going to have more opportunity to cut the cord. But the benefits of being part of an integrated system and having access to diverse resources is, I think, going to be beneficial for a long, long time. So I would see the next stage maybe being more like operating like a microgrid as opposed to completely cutting the cord, though it may be technically feasible to cut the cord.
There's several other questions, and one of them, I guess I was going to ask you guys too. So what's the best way for this work to inform new dockets? And I was going to ask you, who really do you see as most important in taking this work forward?
So I would say, groups like Midwest Cogeneration Association have been active in proceedings in the past. I know Michigan Energy Innovation Business Council, CHP Alliance, these associations have been really fabulous in participating in, intervening in proceedings. I think the challenge is it's expensive and time consuming to intervene. And so just being real about that reality, and but keeping an eye on and monitoring proceedings. Sometimes there's an opportunity if there aren't the resources to sort of launch a full intervention. Sometimes you can submit letters. Sometimes states have less formal stakeholder working groups where they talk about these issues. And so just keeping your eyes peeled for opportunities like that to get into the discussion, keep raising this as an issue, keep it at the forefront of the minds of utilities and regulators and other decision makers. I think it's very worthwhile. But yeah, I mean, ideally, folks would be in proceedings, making the case in proceedings like, and frankly, the proceeding we saw in Minnesota was amazing because it was specific to standby rates. And so I think from my experience, I've participated in, I provided some technical advising in that proceeding, but I've also been an expert witness in bigger rate cases. And it can be overwhelming to be focused on a small, somewhat niche issue of standby rates in a larger general rate case. All of that said, sometimes that's the venue. That's where you have to make the case. And so keeping your eyes open for those opportunities and seizing the opportunity to make the case where you can and where the resources are. I think that that's going to be important going forward.
We have just a couple more minutes left, and so probably time for one more question. But I did want to say that if you want to we'll hang on, and so you can be excused if you need to go. But if you want to hang on and keep talking, we have up to another half hour or so. So let me ask you another question related quickly to these various rate cases and commission dockets. There are also dockets related to renewables, and wondering about the possibility to position those in a way that could support and help combined heat and power at the same time. And also whether positioning CHP as a resilience issue, if that's something people are doing and is a help.
Yeah, so I have two responses to this, and I think Naharika, I think these might both be your questions, and so I was happy to see you here, and I'm happy to see these questions. So on the resilience question, I think there's an opportunity, and this is not something I've seen in any of the standby rates that I've looked at so far, but it's something that occurred to me that could absolutely be there, would be some kind of resilience credit or some kind of, we're talking about charges to the customer, but we aren't capturing the benefits that the CHP system is providing potentially to the grid. And we know that there could be, CHP could be providing services to the grid in terms of a non-wires alternative, depending on the needs of the distribution grid. And so we're seeing advanced distribution planning by utilities. And as we move forward and can really hone in on the best places to put these resources and how particular installations might be particularly beneficial, putting a value on that and providing a credit to the customer. I mean, that's something not only for CHP, but I think it connects also back to your question on renewables. I think there's a larger conversation happening around distributed generation services to the grid. CHP should be a part of that conversation as well. So I think that I think there's a tie-in there. And then I know that there's been important work done around comprehensive electricity planning. So integrated resource planning is, a very hot topic with utilities, and thinking about, generation resources and how generation mix, fits together and through ICF. Megan Kelly and I actually did a report on CHP and IRP. And so, and as we walked that journey, it kept occurring to me that, integrated resource planning, very important, but if you're not looking at it in a comprehensive sense, along with the needs of the distribution grid in advanced distribution planning, then you're not going to capture the full benefits of CHP. It's really hard to have the conversation about CHP just on the generation side, or just as an efficiency resource, right? It provides two important resources, and then of course, grid services as well. So there's a lot of opportunity, but to the extent these utility planning processes are siloed, it's really hard to capture the full benefits. So as the planning processes become more comprehensive, I think the opportunity for CHP just increases.
Can I add a couple of things here, or did you want to say goodbye, Lola, to folks, and then I can add?
I put that in the chat, but let me say thank you to all of you that joined, and we'll be sending the recording out to everyone who registered for the webinar. It'll be posted on the Great Plains Institute YouTube channel. And then I invite you to hang on for as long as you'd like. Well, we'll be here for about another half hour.
So just a couple of things to add to what you were just talking about, Jamie. First of all, a microgrid tariff, as opposed to a CHP tariff, does contemplate the microgrid as both a consumer of resources and an entity that can offer resources to the grid. So one way of making this step to from the CHP being looked at more as a user to the CHP being a partner that's also a resource to the grid is to think about developing a microgrid tariff and evolving the standby tariff into a microgrid option, where you can consider some of these other values like the resiliency value, and resiliency has, needs to be defined. So I'm just assuming that we mean here that resiliency is, there's the resiliency of the facility itself to be able to operate under adverse grid conditions, so to island from the grid and become resilient in and of itself. And then there's resiliency in terms of the resiliency of the community, where perhaps the CHP unit could diminish its own operations and become a resource that helps to keep stability of the grid during a larger reliability or resiliency event. And both of those things are possible, and both of them could be contemplated in a microgrid tariff extension from a, although I've never seen that done. There are proposed microgrid tariffs in some states, and even adopted microgrid tariffs in some states, but I don't know that there's a crosswalk yet for CHP facilities into the microgrid world. So maybe there is. I'd be interested if anybody knows about that. The other thing I wanted to say quickly is this national conversation that we're having, and that we're hoping at some point we understand what a clean energy standard is exactly. Because, but we do know that the clean energy standard is being discussed on a national level. And the clean energy standard opens up the possibility that CHP could be a complying resource under some conditions, or partial comply, part of it could be a complying resource. So, so I think that's a really interesting opportunity, in addition to the other ones that Jamie mentioned. That's all I have. Thanks.
And Carl, the clean energy standard, of course, is being considered both at the federal level and in numerous states.
Yeah.
Are there any states that, or at the federal, where combined heat and power is a part of the picture? You made me wonder.
Actually, so I used to be a commissioner in Nevada, and ORMAT is headquartered in Nevada, and ORMAT is primarily a geothermal company, but they made sure when the portfolio standard passed in California that technologies that captured and used waste heat could get credits towards the renewable portfolio standard. So you could see how that was implemented in the Nevada regulation. I'm not sure if that's the only example, or if there are others. But if ORMAT is active in your state, I would guess that, or if you're a state that has a geothermal resource, I would guess that they have made that pitch in your state as well.
We have another question, which is, what advice do you have, or what do you think the best approach would be if a large industrial is located in a municipal utility or a cooperative utility territory that might not have a standby rate already in place, or might have a standby rate that's unworkable because they never had a project proposed before?
Yeah, so
outside of the regulatory process.
Right. I was, my experience has been sort of working with regulated utilities But in the municipal and cooperative world, you kind of get into the political world, right? Where there's an opportunity to maybe provide education, lobby. I think that there are ways to, go to government leaders and help them to understand, particularly, I think, the economic development side of this conversation. I mean, that's something we saw a lot through the apples to apples comparison was, when we saw across state lines, for example, standby charges varying wildly, that's going to impact where a potential customer wants to site and has economic development, implications for the different states or the different, localities, even within the states, if you're talking about different utility territories. So there's all, you have to kind of figure out you have to go to the decision makers and help them to understand what the customer perspective is, and hopefully through education and understanding what the mutual opportunities are in terms of, the great news is that CHP offers a lot of benefits to the community, and we've been talking about resilience. That's a huge selling point as we face increasingly severe weather events. CHP can be a real selling point in localities for resilience reasons. So I think it's you're not going through a regulatory process, but there's still a lot of education that can take place. And I think it's a good thing we're selling here, right? It's resilience. It's something with a lot of benefits. So I think that bodes well.
I would just add that there are examples of municipals and co-ops that do have standby rates and that do encourage, customer-sided resource inclusion in their own planning processes. So I'm thinking about Sacramento Municipal Utility District and Los Angeles Department of Water and Power are both municipal utilities that have significant cogeneration facilities. But I'm sure there are others that are closer to where most of the audience is today. And also I would say that there are an increasing number of co-op examples where customers are coming to their co-op board and saying, as Jamie was talking about, kind of banging down the door on, why aren't you more open to solar and storage? And, I want to do this. Why can't I do this? So I think there's an opportunity to piggyback on the door banging, that you got some people asking for co-op boards to consider accommodation of newer technologies. And it's a good time maybe to refresh the approach on CHP as well. Well, CHP is not exactly a new technology, but it's, it could be used more. You could encourage more growth of it in your service territory if you did some things differently. And so I think an increasing number of co-op boards and municipal utility governing bodies are being approached with these questions and facing the same challenge of customers saying, well, maybe I don't need you anymore. I could just cut the cord and go off and do my own thing. So I think there are opportunities two ways. One, to see where that's happening in other places and to emulate it. And then two, to look at what else is happening within your co-op footprint or your municipal footprint and think about how could a petition for CHP be joined with some of these other alternative technology petitions that might be coming forward for accommodation.
It seems to me that in Minnesota, we're seeing some door banging up onto the G&T and the municipal power agency, that there might be individual municipal utilities or co-ops that are supportive, but are saying, well, I can't do X because of my contracts. Are you guys seeing that as well?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, Kit Carson Cooperative in New Mexico bought themselves out of Tri-State, which is its G&T, bought itself out of those contracts and is now doing its own procurement and its own self-provision. So there are examples where that's already occurring.
And one more follow-up question on this. Jamie and Carl, if it seems to me there's plenty of examples in your work of here's a sample way to do the standby rates that you could use. And I'm wondering which of these reports you would point people to for that.
I think the Where Things Stand on Standby Rates paper so that was put out through my firm Hunterston Consulting with supported by GPI, and that was in 2019. That is one that has a lot of the sort of anecdotes and examples that were gleaned from the Apples to Apples work, which was put out in 2018. So you're probably going to find some of these gems in 2018, but I think part of why we did the Where Things Stand on Standby Rates report was to kind of put it all together, so that it's like a highlight reel in 2019. So that's a great place to look. And there is a real focus on regulated utilities. So I think an area of further investigation might be this conversation we've just been having around munis and co-ops. That's an area that may be ripe for investigation.
Well, let me ask you all if there's any other questions you have or comments you'd like to share. And also Jamie and Carl, any closing words?
I just want to thank the Great Plains Institute for supporting this work over the years. It's been a really fun and interesting journey. And I want to thank the folks that came to this webinar, everyone who participated in the survey and the interview and has been part of this throughout the years. This is a culmination, and it's exciting, and I hope that it's valuable going forward. We're certainly, it's not over. I think that there's some really important next steps, but thank you for the support. And Carl, thank you for being here and for participating in this work. It's just such a pleasure.
Thank you. I don't have anything in particular to add. I think Jamie's next steps at the end of her paper, I encourage you to look at, next steps and where this can go. And she's just come up with a new one on munis and co-ops. So I think there's plenty of work left to do on this, and I look forward to seeing what you do next, Jamie. And GPI as well. Thank you.
Let me echo the thanks to Jamie, to you for all this great work over the years, and Carl for helping us make sure that this work is aligned with your previous work. And to all of you for hanging on for a few more minutes. Thank you all. And again, we'll post the webinar and get it out to you so that you have it as a resource. And all of these reports are listed in the slide deck. Alyssa, I think we're done.